King's Gallery in downtown New York had always been a place where the world's most avant-garde artists came to be noticed, or perhaps just to disappear into the crowd. The walls were stark white, the lighting sharp and intense, perfect for creating drama, but today something was different. As the crowds wandered past the exhibits, something in the air had shifted. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been warped, like the gallery had become its own living, breathing entity, distorting everything in its path. Among the crowd, a man named Wang Hao stood. He wasn't the sort of person who easily attracted attention, at least, not for the reasons he once had. Once a modest photographer, Wang had risen to fame for his unique ability to manipulate light, to bend shadows to his will. The people around him marveled at his latest work, a series of photographs so detailed, so intricately layered, they seemed less like pictures and more like windows into another world. Wang stood in front of his own work, a piece that was receiving the most admiration, a cityscape at night, captured through the lens of his camera, yet it felt wrong. There was something off about the scene. The lights of the skyscrapers seemed too sharp, the reflections on the glass too perfect, and the shadows too deep. People were whispering to each other, straining their eyes, trying to piece together what they were seeing, but for all their effort, the image refused to make sense. One observer turned to another and said, "I swear, I see myself in this reflection, but it's not me." Wang felt a smug sense of pride as he overheard. He had been working on this piece for weeks, experimenting with new techniques, pushing the boundaries of what light could do. And now, here it was, blurring the line between reality and illusion. People didn't just look at his work, they became part of it. But what he hadn't expected, what no one could have anticipated, was the effect it was starting to have on him. A subtle shift, a distortion in the air, caught his attention. He looked into one of the glass panels of the exhibit. His reflection stared back at him, except it didn't feel like his reflection. His eyes seemed too wide, too distant. His mouth was frozen in a smile that felt hollow. A small shiver crawled up his spine. "Are you okay?" a voice asked from behind him. Wang blinked and turned to face a young woman, an assistant from the gallery. She looked concerned, though she had no idea why. Wang shook his head and smiled, brushing the unease aside. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just taking it all in." But even as he spoke, something in the pit of his stomach told him he was lying. The lights in the room seemed to pulse, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He couldn't explain it, but the sensation of unreality deepened. The shadows in the photograph weren't just shadows anymore, they were alive. Later that night, when the gallery emptied and the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning, Wang lingered behind. He had been left alone in the exhibit, the quiet almost deafening in its emptiness. He stood in front of the photograph again, staring into the lights and shadows he had so carefully crafted. This time, however, he didn't feel the usual thrill of creation. Instead, something inside him stirred, a quiet voice in the back of his mind telling him that maybe he had gone too far. He reached out and touched the glass, and for just a moment, the air around him shimmered. It was subtle, like a distortion in the atmosphere. But Wang knew what it meant. He had done it again. He had bent the fabric of reality just a little more. The moment passed, but something within him had shifted. He had felt it. The power. The control. Wang had always been good with light, he had made a career out of manipulating it. But this was something else. This was a force he could shape, a power that could shape him. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, press events, and gallery openings. Wang was everywhere. His work had taken on a life of its own, and with it, so had his reputation. Critics hailed him as a visionary, a master of light who had transcended traditional photography. His name was on everyone's lips. At first, it was exhilarating. Wang had spent years struggling to get by, lugging his camera from one small show to the next, working odd jobs to keep the lights on. Now, he had everything he had ever dreamed of: fame, fortune, respect. He could finally work without restraint, without having to worry about where his next paycheck would come from. His creations were not just photographs, they were portals, keys to another world. One night, after another sold-out exhibition, Wang found himself at a celebratory dinner with the city's elite. He was seated between a renowned art dealer and a celebrated critic, each hanging on his every word. He smiled, nodded, enjoyed the attention. But beneath the surface, something was changing that he couldn't stop thinking about. The strange sensation he had felt that night at the gallery. The way the air had shimmered. The way the shadows in his photographs had seemed to move, as if they were no longer just images but something real, something he could control. Wang excused himself from the dinner early, his mind racing. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but the truth was clear now: his art, his ability to manipulate light and shadow, was no longer just a tool for expression. It was becoming something darker. The line between what was real and what was created was beginning to blur. He could feel it. The world around him wasn't just reacting to his work, it was starting to obey it. Back in his apartment, he stood before the large canvas he had been working on. It was a still life, a simple scene, a bowl of fruit, a glass of water, a piece of cloth. But as he set up his camera and adjusted the lights, something strange began to happen. The shadows didn't just fall where they should, they moved, shifted, bent in unnatural ways. The fruit on the table seemed to glow, its colors becoming unnaturally vivid. He snapped a shot, then another. Each time, the scene seemed to warp further, becoming more and more surreal. He leaned in, his heart pounding, staring at the photos. The fruit in the bowl, something was wrong. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. For a brief moment, he felt as if the world was slipping away. He looked up from the photo and found himself in a completely different room, though it was exactly the same. The air was colder, the shadows darker. The light from the street lamp outside now spilled in through his window, casting long, impossibly sharp beams of light across the floor. Wang stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't possible. The photo had to be wrong. It had to be the lighting, the camera angle. But as he turned around, the room was still off. There was something wrong with the way the shadows moved, the way the light twisted. He reached for the light switch, but when he flicked it, nothing happened. The lights in his apartment stayed dim, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, more menacing. It felt like he was standing in a space that wasn't quite real, a place that existed only in his mind, but somehow it had seeped out into the physical world. And that's when it hit him: the line between the two was vanishing. Wang's obsession grew. Every day, he retreated further into his work, using his growing ability to manipulate light and shadow to create more complex, more beautiful illusions. It wasn't enough anymore to simply take a picture. He wanted to become the image, to lose himself within it. His art was no longer just a reflection of reality, it was an alternate reality, a world that bent to his will. But the more he immersed himself in his creations, the more the world around him began to slip away. Faces began to blur, names became unimportant. The world outside his apartment became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the next illusion, the next image that would carry him deeper into the maze he had created. Wang began to forget what it was like to feel grounded in the physical world. At night, he no longer slept. He worked endlessly, crafting images that spiraled further and further from the realm of the tangible. The people in his life, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, began to drift away. They didn't understand the pull of his work, the magnetic force that kept him trapped inside his own mind. But even as Wang's fame grew, even as his influence spread across the art world, something was wrong. The lights in his photographs began to bleed into his real life, leaking out of his studio and into the apartment, into his very perception of reality. He saw faces that weren't there, felt the touch of hands that didn't exist. The illusion he had so carefully crafted was beginning to consume him, to turn against him. One night, after staring into the depths of one of his latest works, a portrait of himself, but not quite him, Wang felt something shift inside him. The world around him dissolved, the walls closing in, and the shadows reached out, swallowing him whole. Wang's heart thudded in his chest as he stared at the self-portrait hanging on the wall, its lights pulsating like a heartbeat of its own. His reflection in the image stared back at him, but the eyes were wrong, wide, unnervingly so, almost as if they were mocking him. He shook his head, trying to clear the dizziness swirling in his mind. It was just a painting. Just a photograph. Nothing more. But as the shadows stretched longer, darker across the room, Wang realized it wasn't just the images that were shifting. It was everything. The floor under his feet felt like it was warping, bending, as though the room itself was expanding outward, becoming something otherworldly. The air became thick, as if filled with static electricity. The sharp, artificial light above him flickered, casting erratic, impossible shadows that twisted on the walls. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of panic that he stumbled back from the portrait, his breathing shallow. He wasn't sure how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. The room, the very air around him, felt unstable, fluid, as though it had lost its anchor in reality. Wang reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. He needed to call someone. Anyone. His mind raced for a logical explanation, but it was all slipping away, fading into the same indistinct fog that had clouded his perceptions for days now. He dialed the first number he could think of, the gallery assistant who had been so worried about him after his strange behavior at the opening. Hello? The voice on the other end was faint, as if coming from underwater. Anna, Wang gasped, his voice hoarse. Anna, something's happening. I don't know what's real anymore. The lights, everything's shifting. What's going on, Wang? Are you okay? Anna's voice cracked with concern, but there was a distant quality to it, as though the words were traveling through a tunnel, far removed from his own world. Wang opened his mouth to reply, but his voice died in his throat. He couldn't speak. He couldn't articulate what was happening to him. The words felt as though they were slipping through his fingers. And then, the room tilted. Wang lurched forward, catching himself on the desk. His reflection in the darkened window across from him was no longer just a reflection. It was moving, his own image twisting into something alien. A figure stood there, behind him, in the window. It wasn't his reflection, but someone else, someone closer to him than anyone had ever been. A cold rush of fear poured over him, chilling his bones. The figure in the window smiled, and Wang recognized the smile as his own, except it wasn't. It was warped, deformed, a twisted version of his own features. The eyes were too wide, too empty. The smile, an empty, hollow thing that stretched impossibly wide across his face. Wang? Anna's voice broke through, but it was drowned by a louder, more insistent whisper that seemed to come from all around him. You're not alone. You've never been alone. Wang spun around, heart hammering in his chest. The room had grown darker, the shadows thickening until they swallowed everything. The air was heavier now, suffocating. His skin tingled with an electric hum, as though he was standing in the middle of a storm. The walls closed in, and the familiar space he had once called home, his studio, his sanctuary, was no longer his own. He dropped the phone to the floor, the connection still buzzing in his pocket. His body felt like it was being tugged in every direction at once. He stumbled toward the door, but as his hand reached for the handle, the shadows leaped forward, curling around his wrist, pulling him back. You can't escape, they whispered, their voices a chorus in his head. You belong to us now. Wang tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. The door before him had warped, the wood twisting into grotesque shapes. He backed away, unable to take his eyes off it. There was something insidious about the way it bent, as though reality itself was bending with it. In the far corner of the room, something caught his eye. A small, flickering image, a photograph he had taken years ago, back when his life still felt simple, back before the light and shadows had started consuming him. The edges of the photograph seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and the face in the image, his face, began to move. His eyes blinked. His lips parted into that same twisted grin that had haunted him earlier. The room felt suffocating now. Every surface seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, as though the very walls were alive, watching him. He stumbled back toward the desk, grabbing at anything to steady himself, but the objects around him had lost their shape. His pens were no longer pens, but jagged shapes that cut into his skin as he reached for them. The books on the shelf were mere outlines, their titles unreadable, their spines warped into unrecognizable forms. It was no longer a studio. It was a prison of his own making. He had created this, built it, with every photo, every frame, every image he'd ever taken. He had twisted the world with his light, but now it had come for him, consuming everything. In a desperate bid to break free, Wang turned and ran toward the window. He was dimly aware that he was shaking, his body trembling with fear. He reached for the glass, his fingers brushing against its cold surface, and for the briefest of moments, it seemed as though the world outside might be normal. But as he pressed his palm against the window, the cityscape outside shimmered, distorting like a reflection in water. The skyline bent, the buildings warped, and for a fleeting moment, the streets below became nothing but empty black voids. The world was a lie, and then, as if everything had finally come to a head, the room snapped, everything froze, time stretched and stuttered like an old film reel, and in that frozen moment, Wang saw it. He saw the source, the origin of it all. It was the light, the very light that had first sparked his ability to create. It was more than just light. It was a presence, an entity, something that fed on creation and illusion, something that had been with him all along, lurking in the shadows of every frame he had ever taken. You think you control it, but you are the illusion. The voice rang clear in his mind, like a bell that shattered everything he had believed. The light was not his to control. It had been controlling him, feeding off his need to create, warping him in the process. And now, there was no escaping it. It was inside him, woven into the very fabric of his being. Wang fell to his knees, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. The shadows around him grew darker, closing in like a blanket. The light in the room flickered once more, then went out completely. The darkness was all-encompassing, but even in the suffocating dark, he could still see it, the glow of the photographs, faint but unmistakable. His images, his creations, stood out in the void like dim stars in a black sky. They were his. They were everything. And now, they were the only thing left. As the shadows swallowed him whole, Wang finally understood that he was no longer the creator, that he was the created, and in the end, all that was left was the illusion. The room was pitch black now, but Wang could still feel it, the presence of something vast, something ancient, lurking in the space between the images he had created. It was a cold, unfeeling thing, yet somehow it pulsed with a deep, unsettling energy, like the heartbeat of an unconscious beast. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he turned, no matter how hard he tried to move, it was there, circling him, folding into him, pulling him deeper into itself. The shadows closed in tighter, but it wasn't just the shadows anymore. The darkness itself seemed to liquefy, an inky substance that crept along the walls, lapping at the edges of his vision. For a moment, Wang thought he heard breathing, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from all directions. His heart hammered in his chest, a thundering rhythm that mingled with the sound of his footsteps. No, they weren't his footsteps. They couldn't be. You're nothing but a reflection, the voice whispered again. A fragment, a shadow within the light. The whisper wasn't in his ears, but inside his head. The voice was his own, but warped, like 1,000 versions of him, all colliding at once. Each word dripped with venom, each syllable laced with a cold, distant fury. He wasn't sure anymore if the voice was real or another hallucination, another distortion of the reality he had been shaping, bending for so long that it all began to sink in, the hours spent tweaking light, adjusting shadows, pushing the limits of what the human eye could comprehend. It had all been feeding this thing, this force that had lived within his images from the very beginning. Wang had thought he was controlling it, that his mastery over light was a triumph. But he had been wrong. It wasn't the light that was powerful. It was the shadows. And the shadows had been using him to gain form, to solidify itself in the waking world. He had once believed he was an artist, but now he understood the terrible truth: the artist was just the vessel. The creations were what lived. The images around him flickered, each one sharper, more defined, as though they were cutting through the layers of reality itself. In one corner of the room, a photograph of a forest seemed to warp. Trees began to shift, bending and twisting in impossible angles. The ground beneath them, once solid and dependable, began to ripple like water. Wang couldn't look away. The photograph seemed to stretch into infinity, the trees becoming more distorted with every passing second. He saw himself now, in the photograph, standing beneath the twisting branches, but his figure was not still. It moved, in a jerking, unnatural way, like a puppet struggling to break free of its strings. "Stop," Wang whispered, his voice hoarse. But the words were powerless. The photograph was no longer his to control. It was alive, its shapes growing and receding, like something that had been locked in a box, only now escaping. The room seemed to melt around him, the very walls flickering, dissolving into pieces, the images creeping up to swallow him. His mind screamed for release, but it couldn't find a way out. The world had become a series of illusions, and Wang had no idea if he was still standing in his apartment, or if he had already slipped through the cracks of reality. The distinction no longer mattered. It was all the same now, the same horrible, confining space where everything was nothing. For a moment, Wang's thoughts scrambled, his mind a cacophony of desperate noise. He tried to focus, to remember what had happened, what had led him here, but the memories slipped through his fingers like water. There was the flash of light, yes, the accident that had begun it all, the accident that had given him the power to manipulate light and shadow. But the accident wasn't just a catalyst. It had been a trap, a seed planted in his mind, slowly growing, until now it had taken root in every corner of his consciousness. Wang took a step forward, his legs weak, trembling beneath him. His reflection, or was it his reflection, in the glass shimmered, and he saw something in the distance. A figure stood there, in the dark space beyond the edge of the room, just beyond his reach. It was a version of himself, but this one was different. This one was dressed in black, his features sharper, more defined, but his eyes, those eyes were the same vacant eyes Wang had seen in the photograph earlier. The eyes were hollow, consumed by the light that had no source. "You are not you," the figure spoke, and its voice echoed, layered over with 1,000 different tones. Wang froze, his breath caught in his throat. The room shifted again, and the figure stepped forward, its feet barely touching the floor. The shadows writhed around it, as though the figure was being pulled into the darkness itself. "You have always been part of this," the figure said, and now its voice was everywhere, inside Wang's skull, inside his very blood. "You have always been a part of the illusion. And now, you will join it forever." Wang wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. He tried to turn, to escape, but his body was paralyzed, rooted to the floor by the weight of the figure's words. It was true. He had always known it, deep down, even as he had reveled in his power, his ability to shape the world through light and shadow. He had always known that something wasn't right, that the power he wielded wasn't just creative, it was corrupting. The figure stepped forward again, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. Wang tried to look away, but the darkness pressed in on him from every angle. It felt as though the shadows were crawling under his skin, around his spine, suffocating him from within. His vision blurred, the edges of the room collapsing into itself as the walls seemed to shrink, the darkness tightening its grip on his mind, and then it was all gone. The walls vanished, and the photographs, his photographs, were no longer images. They were worlds. He could see them now, in their full, horrific clarity. The streets he had once captured, the faces of strangers frozen in time, all of them were alive, writhing, twisting in unnatural ways. They reached for him, pulled at him, and he felt himself drawn into the dark void between the frames. He was no longer standing. He was falling. The fall seemed endless, the sensation of weightlessness consuming him as he descended into the abyss. The light was gone, the shadows consuming it all, devouring him. And the last thing Wang saw, the only thing left, was his own face, staring back at him from the deepest, most twisted corner of his mind. That it was the face he had once created. And it was the face that had created him.